Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished visitors and guests. I consider it a tremendous honor to be with you today as we come together in fellowship and solemn celebration to remember all our military veterans, both past and present, and the great sacrifices they have made for all of us. It is indeed an honor to join with such wonderful patriots and fellow veterans here in the heart of the Sand Hills region of our great state of North Carolina. I am so pleased that the citizens of Pinehurst and the Military Officers Association of America see fit to pay homage to the veterans of our armed forces and to recognize the importance of this day and the priceless gift of freedom so many of our veterans have given us. I was born at a U.S. Army camp on the island of Okinawa, Japan, 15 years after the end of World War II. For the uninitiated, the island of Okinawa is famous in the minds of older Americans and students of military history. This was the site of some of the most ferocious combat of World War II, and it's a place of one of the last battles of World War II where so many of our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen gave their lives to secure the final victory in that war for our great country. And I am the son of a professional soldier who served in the U.S. Army for 30 years. I earned my higher education degree at the Military College of South Carolina, the Citadel, and I served as a U.S. Army officer for 31 years, as a soldier, a field artilleryman, a paratrooper, and as a physician. And as it was said, I'm now a medical officer at the Veterans Health Administration and privileged to serve our veterans at the Fayetteville Veterans Administration Medical Center. So as you can imagine, I have a special place in my heart for all veterans. They are a noble band of brothers and sisters who have endured trials and hardships that few can truly understand unless you are a veteran. So what does it mean to be a veteran? To paraphrase the words of Lieutenant Colonel George Goodson, United States Marine Corps retired, himself a veteran of 3 combat tours in Vietnam. Quote, a veteran is someone who at one point wrote a blank check made payable to the citizens of the United States of America for an amount up to and including his or her own life. That is honor, end quote. So it is a right and noble thing that we do here today, to take pause on this day to give honor and praise to all the military men and women of our great nation, past and present. Our country has gone to war many times over the last 240 years, and in doing so, it has asked much from its citizens. For when a nation goes to war, it asks us, its citizens, to sacrifice our places in society, to leave everything and everyone we hold dear, and in return it promises us that we will endure hardships and austere conditions, and we will be put into harm's way on the field of battle. Of the families that must stay behind, the mothers and the fathers, the sisters, brothers, spouses, and children, our country asks them to surrender their fathers, surrender their mothers, their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. In short, our nation asks us for our most prized possessions. It demands from us our most beloved family and friends. And in times of war, our country is unable to give us assurances that these men and women will return safely home. And the nature of war is such that the greatest part of the burden falls on our youth. So often it's the young men and the young women who are called to arms and thrust into the midst of the most awesome and terrifying endeavors humanity can devise. So Veterans Day was inaugurated in our country in the first part of the last century to mark the end of World War I on the 11th of November, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning in Europe, The warring parties of the First World War signed an armistice that ended the bloodshed that had claimed so many lives of so many soldiers, so many brave people. It was called the Great War back then, and the war to end all wars. And during World War I, peoples and nations around the world learned of the awesome and terrible power of modern technology and what it could bring to the battlefield. And worldwide, the total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was over 38 million. 17 million deaths and 20 million wounded. And for the first time ever, the world saw wide-scale use of combat aviation, aerial bombardment, submarines, tanks, machine guns, and chemical weapons. And that war spanned 4 long years. And our nation joined this conflict during its last 2 years. At that point in Europe, the entire continent was exhausted and faltered, locked in the stalemate of trench warfare. And many historians cite that it was our American fighting forces, their entry into the war, that broke that stalemate and won the victory. During World War I, America mobilized over 4 million men into military service. Over 116,000 Americans died in the war, and over 200,000 were wounded. So it was the hope of many around the world on the 11th of November, 1918, that mankind would never engage in such warfare again. And it was in that spirit that this day of commemoration was inaugurated. So on Veterans Day, we are called upon to refresh our knowledge of our history of military sacrifice and to remind ourselves of the terrible human cost of war, to find new inspiration, to strive more ardently for peace. But what has happened since World War I and that first Veterans Day? Only 20 years after the conclusion of World War I, a greater and more terrible war broke out as World War II began in Europe in 1939, and it spread like a contagion across the world. The calamity and death of World War II dwarfed that which occurred in World War I. Globally, there were more than 15 million servicemen and women killed, 25 million were wounded, and most staggering of all, the number of civilian deaths during World War II was over 45 million. Over a span of 4 years, during World War II, the United States mobilized over 16 million men and women for service in the armed forces. 400,000 servicemen and women gave their lives for our country, and over 600,000 were wounded. And the greatest proportion of these were young men and young women in the flower of their youth, their early 20s, their mid-20s. Only 4 years after the conclusion of World War II, we were principal combatants in the Korean conflict, a UN effort to stem the tide of nationalistic communism, and over 33,000 Americans lost their lives during that conflict at a rate of 2,000 combat deaths a day. Again, young men and women in the flower of their youth. 12 years later, we were again at war in Vietnam. 8,744,000 servicemen and women were mobilized for that war effort. 57,000 lost their lives during the conflict, and 153,000 more were wounded. Since then, we have been engaged in other wars and combat operations around the world, most notably the Gulf War in 1991, and now the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are places far from home where Americans continue to serve with honor. When the bugle sounds and the call to arms goes out, our nation asks us to give of our very selves. The call to arms also calls out to the families of our servicemen and women. The call is one of deep and lasting sacrifice. For many times, young men and young women who must leave their families to go to war come back forever changed, bearing the physical and psychological scars of war, or Some never come home again. So, what is a veteran? A veteran is someone who stepped forward and answered our nation's call for help, raised his or her right hand, swore an oath to protect and defend our nation and our Constitution. He or she put on the uniform of the armed services of the United States of America, picked up a rifle, and they took their posts. In doing so, these courageous men and women wrote out that blank check, made payable to the citizens of the United States of America for an amount up to and including his or her own life. My friends, that is courage, that is sacrifice, and that is the ultimate expression of love. Love of freedom, love of home and hearth, and love for the people of this nation. For greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Veterans have paid a price none of us can reimburse. In our nation's 240-year history, over 1.3 million veterans have paid the ultimate price, giving their lives for us. We are blessed that we live in a nation that can bring forth such men and women of valor and courage. And although it has fallen from fashion these days, I am moved here on this Veterans Day to give public thanks to Lord God Almighty for the courage and sacrifice of the millions of citizen soldiers of our great country. And I thank him for his abundant gifts of patriotism, valor, fortitude, which he renews and brings forth from this nation, generation by generation, over and over again. This day, this commemoration that we make today is a great gesture of love and respect offered by you, the citizens of Pinehurst and the greater Sand Hills region, to all our veterans, near and far, past and present. And I find myself among true friends and fellow patriots who have seen fit to honor and commemorate our veterans here today. And as an old soldier, I salute you all. And on behalf of all veterans, we thank you for this honor. And I thank you personally for the privilege of being able to speak to you today. May God bless America.